Welcome back. We're now going to be going through Rhapsody on a Windy Night, which is set as part of the Module B unit of work for the HSC for Advanced English. So, just a few contextual things that we need to deal with first. And this is a little bit different to the presentation I did in class, so it's well worth your while to tune in. There's a few more details on context. Okay. Okay. So before you read the poem, if you're coming into it fresh, predict what you think the poem might be about. How might it be similar or different to the other two poems that we've already done? What connotations do you have with the idea of wind? In musical terms, what is a rhapsody? You can look that up, or you can wait for my answer. I've got that on a slide coming up. Are there other meanings to the word rhapsody? And what might this mean in the context of the poem? So we again have a 22-year-old. He's writing this in 1911. It's not published until later, and so some sources actually do talk about it in terms of contextually reflecting World War I, which of course breaks out a few years after this. So I can't see why it would be wrong to talk about that, because that's the audience at the time's experience as well, even if not his when he wrote it. He's writing in Paris. Again, we've got that urban setting, the cityscape, and he's been influenced by, I'm just going to move my bubble a little bit there so we can see what's written there, influenced by the philosophy of Henry Bergson at the time of writing Rhapsody, although Eliot's belief in these theories did not last for an extensive time. So it's well worth you going and having a little look at that. It might be helpful as a bit of extra extension context for you. I'm going to go into some other contextual ideas, so you can go and look that up. So the other context that people refer to when they're looking at it is World War I. Different sources kind of put it in this 1915, 1917 time period. People are affected by the war. It's devastating. People haven't seen anything this awful before. The poem is a type of escape. Now, is it the escape from World War I, although he's written it earlier, it's published later, or is the escape more to do with just escaping the hell that is your own mind? And so the speaker of the poem escapes into his own mind and recaps memories while at the same time observing his surroundings on his night stroll. And of course that stroll brings with it the memories. Now, I didn't bring this up in class, but I am going to address it here. There is a little bit of an elephant in the room when we're talking about our friend Eliot. So some sources ignore that there's some aspects of him that aren't really very pleasant, and other people really make it their mission to highlight it. So I thought we better talk about it, because some of it becomes clear in this poem, and then you can go back and maybe have a look at Prufrock and maybe see if you can see some of these misogynistic ideas coming through. So he was, the question is respected, revered, preeminent poet actually a raging misogynist? Does it matter? Doesn't matter if he is. Does it impact the work? Isn't he just a product of his time? I challenge you, though, that yes, it may have reflected some values of the time, but not every man had these misogynistic ideas at that time. And of course, we've got the suffragette movement, who was the first wave of feminism, and they're emerging around this time in the Western world in various countries as well, and perhaps are fighting some of the ideas that he puts forward. And can we actually judge him by our own values in the 21st century? I'm going to leave that to you to answer, and there'll be lots of different ideas out there. So I'm just going to move my bubble again, sorry. T.S. Eliot was one of the century's preeminent poets, great artist, and perhaps the premier modernist. He was also an anti-Semite, a racist, and a misogynist. Now, the racism and the anti-Semitism is not really relevant to this poem that we're doing, but the misogyny does come through. There's a couple of ways of reading a few of the images that he talks about in terms of women. So I just wanted those to be addressed, and they'll come up as we do the analysis. And then, so Kakutani from the New York Times in 1997 goes on to say, although these two statements should be self-evident to anyone who has read his body of work, they've proven particularly difficult for literary scholars and ardent Wasteland, that's one of his poems, fans to swallow. Reaction to two new Eliot books suggests that we are reluctant to acknowledge the obvious, that talent does not translate into wisdom, that beauty does not mean truth. So like I said, although some of his works do have anti-Semitism and some racist undertones, today what we're more going to be worried about is this, the misogyny. Sorry, let's go back. So, and does it matter? There's a couple of ways of reading his work. I found it quite uncomfortable as a woman reading it, and I was, I'm a little surprised by women who don't feel a bit of discomfort as well, because it's there, and it's quite icky. So his context as a modernist, he's using symbolism again very extensively, not a new technique, but the poets or writers of modernism, they leave more to the reader's imagination. It's experimental in nature, the form and the structure, again, we see those ideas of it being a little bit different. Free verse, there's no set rhyme scheme. There are rhymes, sometimes they're internally with the line and sometimes they are at the end of lines, but they're irregular, and there's no real prediction, to be able to say, okay, well, there should be this rhyming scheme here, we're expecting a rhyme coming up. You don't have that, and maybe that's to show that life is not full of neat moments. And memories come higgledy-piggledy from all sorts of places, and they're not organised. Stream of consciousness again, and that's created by this enjambment. There's a point where with the fantasies, with the memories, that fantasy is very difficult to untangle from reality. And again, with the ideas that he's exploring, these ones are probably more technique. This is more the ideas. He's got a disillusionment with the modern world, and disconnection and isolation come through very, very strongly with what he's doing there. So about the title. Eliot often gave titles that had a musical aspect. You've got love song, you've got preludes, and a rhapsody is a free instrumental composition in one extended movement, especially one that is emotional in character, which fits with what he's doing. It is an emotional poem. And this word fits Eliot's poem with its free verse, irregular metre, line lengths, and irregular stanza lengths, and emotional content. So you can start to see why he's used that title, Rhapsody. So a rhapsody can also be an effusively enthusiastic or ecstatic expression of feeling. There's an irony there because there's not really a lot of enthusiasm, and it's not ecstatic. There is a lot of feeling, but they're not positive feelings that we're getting out of it. A free instrumental composition in one extended movement, typical that is emotional, exuberant in character. It's quite downtrodden, so it's not exuberant. A portion of an epic poem adapted for recitation, a miscellaneous collection, a highly emotional utterance, a highly emotional literary work, effusively rapturous or extravagant discourse. So as we read through, you can start to see for yourself, where that title actually does match and where maybe the title's a little bit of an irony. Okay, so synonyms of a rhapsody, so words that mean the same thing: elation, happiness, joy, joyousness, delight, glee, excitement, exhilaration, animation, jubilation, exultation, ecstasy, bliss, cloud nine, heaven, paradise, seventh heaven, top of the world. We kind of actually delve more into a hell. So these words that are supposed to be synonyms with rhapsody, they're not really in line with what he's doing. And then antonyms, so the opposites, depression and misery. And a lot of what he talks about is depression. And that duality in the title of the fact that he's playing with the title and these synonyms of, what a rhapsody is versus the opposite. He does that because he has a lot of contrasts of juxtaposition of opposites. So when he says one thing, he means something else sometimes. So it's an ironic title, perhaps, because it suggests a mood of enthusiasm or a frenzy that the poem does not convey. A situation that could be romantic, so a midnight stroll. Eliot manages to make it into something isolated, full of despair. And the wind is kind of introduced with words like sputtered. But there's more emptiness that goes on, so you can read the slide yourself. And the images that I've pulled up here, these are ones that are actually made by artists representing what they see as a result from reading the poem. Okay, so I'm going to move my bubble again. Initial question. So after you've read it the first time, what is the poem definitely about? What does the poem make me think about? What phrases or words or lines am I confused or unsure about? What aspects of the poem do I need to find out more about? And are there symbols I can research? So a bit of this is on you. I will give you a lot, but some of this you're going to need to research. And at an advanced level, there is an expectation that the top students are taking what's given in class, taking what they're finding in readings, but then doing a bit of extension reading beyond that. So a few things that we need to unpack before we even get into it is this symbolism. What does the moon represent? Because the moon's very, very a very powerful image in this. I look like a little bit of a moon. I'll put myself there. So it's got to do with time, cycles, the psyche, the emotional part of ourselves, shadows, wonder. So you've got some of these things where the moon itself can mean a couple of different things, and sometimes they're contradictory. Interesting that we're talking about, we've got a symbol also of fertility that comes back again later, mystery, passivity, because he is quite passive in his process of going through. My mouse isn't working and I need to move myself. Okay, so the moon, again, you can have a read through this, producing this idea that the moon doesn't create her own life source is interesting, and that we often do put a female voice onto the moon. Again, that's quite interesting too. So you can have a read through that. I'm not going to read the slide for you. Now, some more on the moon. In animal symbolism, the moon shares an association with water and her influence over the tides. That comes up in this idea of the crab, and again links in with the moon is a divine matron of all sea creatures. Again, matron being female, specifically those with shell coverings, i.e. crabs, and crabs come up as an image in the poem. And there's a bit more on the moon. I'm quite obsessed with the moon, obviously. Again, feminine. Phases of the moon symbolize immortality and eternity, can reflect inner knowledge, and that's kind of what he's talking about in this too, because it's kind of all happening in the mind. This idea here often represents the realm between the conscious and the unconscious, because he should be in bed. He's not, but he should be. And the moon itself provides analogy of human development, and this is a very, very interesting meaning in terms of the poem and what it's talking about, because it's about this cycling through the evening only to go home, brush your teeth, leave your shoes at the door ready for the next day, to start the cycle of life again. So again, I think this is the bottom one there, really, really interesting, and one that you could use in your writing to apply to your to add a bit of depth and breadth to your response, and to kind of make it a bit more insightful. So flowers generally, so we have some flower images that come up as well. Celebration, so again, there's that duality. It can be something to do with weddings and celebrations, birthdays, parties, spring, rebirth, new life. But then it's all got this duality of sadness, funerals, commemorations, sympathy. It can be get well. It can be, death, bereavement, grief. And then later in the poem, he talks about dead flowers. And, that kind of brings up this idea of destruction, death, decimation, calamity. Sliding myself over, this could get annoying for you, sorry. So geraniums are mentioned twice. That's why I wanted to look at the flower idea first, and now geraniums specifically, because they're one of the ones mentioned. In the Victorian era, and the audience that the initial audience of the time would have understood this and had this as an understanding, means stupidity or folly, can mean courtliness, elegance, gentility, and a peaceful mind, and he does not have a peaceful mind. If you expect to meet with a particular person, you should give them a geranium. This social plant you can read about. I don't know that the Japanese understanding will have much bearing, but it was interesting. And the other is, if geraniums are planted near a window, it's said that flies will not come into your home. So this idea of them warding off something that's unpleasant, and yet he's in an unpleasant state of mind. Some of the meanings are quite conflicting. Again, we've got that duality coming through, and sometimes there's nuances depending on the colour. So it can mean folly or stupidity, gentility, melancholy, but it's also a bridal favour. Unexpected meeting, expected meeting. So, you've got these opposites going on. Sand is, again, brought up in the poem. It stained her dress. Now, the interesting thing is that sand can't stain. It moves off. It doesn't, unless it's wet, it doesn't leave any mark of being there. The complex symbolism of sand refers to the transient impermanence of being. So it can also refer to the microcosm of one grain, or of the macrocosm of, an entire desert or a beach. And it does create a cohesion within the poem, because he does transport us to a beach scene again. And we often end up at the beach with Eliot. The diverse illustration of comfort offered by a beach, and the sudden violence of a sandstorm. So, it can be something really lovely, a day out at the beach in the summer sun, But, there's also the violence of sandstorms, and I suppose also of the waves and the beach in a storm, if the waves are affected. We have a cat again, and so we have this idea with the cat of being aloof, flexible, agile, introverted, sneaky. They're quite self-contained and self-sufficient, aren't they? They're weary of other people, and they're quite dependent. They'll stay on their own. They're domesticated. They're with their people when it suits them. But they're quite an isolated animal too. If you've ever owned a cat, you'll know what I'm talking about. If you haven't, you might need to do a bit of research. But they are the type of animal that generally will come to you when they need something and want something, opposite to a dog. A dog, they're loving on you all the time. And we've got the crab. The crab's a really important image that we have. So we've got that it's got to do with cycles, which links to the lunar, which links to the moon, which is a big image. It can have connotations of trust, emotion, protection, because it's got its snappers. Regeneration, because it takes off its shell and as it outgrows its external skeleton. And transformation. So theme of protection again. They have strong lunar symbols because they mate according to the moons and the tides, so that when the larvae are ready to take their next bit of the journey, the tides are at the right levels and they're swept out to safety. They never take a direct forward head-on route. They do a sideways dance. So if I was standing up, I could do my little dance for you, but maybe I'll have to save it for a bloopers video. They're not communal, and they've got claws that they can use as weapons or defense, and they don't look particularly pleasant. They look scary. Some people call them the spiders of the sea as well. The barnacles were interesting too, and so this is what barnacles look like on rocks, and this is a poor little crab quite covered in them. They're a little bit parasitic. They've got to live on something else. Sometimes they choose rocks, and other times they choose things like crabs. And so they attach themselves. It's quite disgusting how they attach themselves. They use some sort of spitty glue that they make themselves, and then they hang upside down. They're quite a funny little thing. Chestnuts again, we come up to, they're an important image. They're repeated. Again, we've got another fertility symbol, provision, abundance, longevity, invigoration. The chestnut tree symbolises chastity, honesty, and justice. So we've got these ideas of sexuality again. And when we think about chastity, generally, people are talking more about a female chastity. So the symbolic meaning of chestnuts deals primarily with prevention and foresight. This is due to the fact that the chestnut has long been recognised as a highly nutritious food that has a high calorie punch in such a small package. So people used to, back in the day, pack them away if they were going to war, and if you had the chestnuts, you would be nutritionally satisfied for a while. So with the symbolism of chestnuts, there's a masculine energy about them, the fire element, associated with the god Zeus. They're eaten to encourage fertility and desire, and yet they're also this symbol of chastity. Very interesting there, the duality. Chestnut wood's important. There's some notes there. Chestnuts in Japan symbolises difficulties and overcoming them. They're eaten on New Year's Day for success and strength. And here we come back to this idea of chastity, which is going to link us back to the misogyny, and some of those references to women that made me quite uncomfortable. And I don't know if it might have made some of the girls uncomfortable when they first read it as well, and maybe some of the boys to cringe. Early Christian folklore says that chestnut symbolize chastity because it is surrounded by thorns and not damaged by them. So they remain, in their pure state. The structure of Rhapsody on a Windy Night, it's a lyric poem in free verse divided into 6 stanzas, and they vary in length. There's no set structure. Some are 9 and some are 23 lines each. There's the separate closing line that really packs a punch. It's quite negative. And the title reflects the poem's form, since in music a rhapsody is an irregular and unstructured piece. The poem at first appears to be an uncontrolled jumble of oddly juxtaposed images in lines and stanzas of irregular length with no consistent rhyme scheme, but with scattered rhymes, repetitions, and variations throughout. Fun fact, some of the phrases from Rhapsody appear in the lyrics to the song Memory by Andrew Lloyd Webber, his musical Cats, which was inspired by Eliot's book of light verse for children. Memory is a key word for the poem, and the word occurs 5 times, and there's also things that symbolise memory as well. So it's explicitly used a number of times, but then it's implied probably even more times. So before, including the first stanza and the final one. Now, this can be a difficult poem to get your bearings around. And even once you do think you've got an understanding of it, again, within that modernist context, you find yourself confused and caught up in knots again. So a summary of this, stanza by stanza: it's a windy night. We start at 12, finish at 4, and then he goes home. He's wandering the streets by moonlight. We've got this idea of memories, and they're vague and indistinct. The light of the street lamp seems to emit a sound as well as a light, fatalistic drum, and the abstract midnight appears to possess agency, shaking the speaker's memories about much. As a madman shakes a flower, the implication being that this time of night exercises this effect upon our memory without it being conscious of what it does, like the madman. It's a continuation on from Preludes, that midnight, the middle of the night, insomnia, takes your mind on a journey of imagination, of memory, things that did happen, or your version of the memory. Then we move forward an hour, so he's constantly time stamping for us. Now the very street lamps appear to speak, beckoning the speaker to a woman standing in a doorway, probably a lady of the night or prostitute. We kind of start with some ideas of misogyny. Her appearance isn't exactly flattering, but she also symbolises this isolation. Her job is really to connect with other people, and even she hesitates towards him. Is it because it's him, or is it to show that we have a society that is really disconnected and disconnecting? As we go on, you can kind of be the judge of that. And I guess in terms of textual integrity and this modernist idea of getting you to think, he wants you to be thinking about these ideas. Which is it? Is it that there's something wrong with him and he feels a bit put out by it, or just purely because people just really don't want to connect? The sand on the woman's dress appears to call up a memory of a time spent on a beach and the twisted branch of a tree, dried out and bare, which the speaker recalls seeing there, looking like the bones of the very earth jutting out of the ground. The image of the broken spring in a factory yard covered with rust suggests a loss of energy and vitality. This coiled spring was once capable of bouncing and contracting and expanding is now abandoned, useless, without life. We move towards another hour to 2:30. Speaker of this poem must be an insomniac, and we're wondering, when's he going to go home to bed, and what's he going to do? When is he going to do something else? The street lamps start talking to him again, telling him to observe a cat in the gutter. The animal is eating some stinking and gone off butter. And then this image seems to call up an image from the speaker's childhood when he saw a child slipping out its hand in one darting movement, like the cat's tongue, slipping out to devour the butter, to pocket a toy that was running along the quay. We're back at the beach again, perhaps a childhood holiday at the seaside. And people do get confused. Is the cat part of the memory, or is the cat actually there? And I actually think it's meant to make you question reality and what's happening and when's it happening and why is it happening. The speaker could not look inside that child's mind to discover why it took that toy. He then recalls an old crab covered in barnacles. This one doesn't have as many barnacles on it as the other image I found, which he found one afternoon in a rock pool and played with the stick, and this idea of fighting it. Then we have another hour down, 3:30, and the lamp speaks again. Someone's asked the question, is he drunk or just sleep deprived? The later it gets, the more his mind might be playing tricks. The lamp instructs the speaker to look at the moon, recites a line in French, which translates to as the moon holds no grudges. The moon has lost her memory, we are told, and the craters on its pale surface are likened to the pock marks left on the face of a smallpox survivor. Quite a gross image. This moon also has hands, one of which twists a paper rose smelling of dust and perfume. We'll come back to that. That could be misogynistic, or it could be just neutral. I want you to think about that. Depending on the school of thought and the critics you find as well, some of them are very protective of Eliot. They don't want anyone talking about his perceptions of women. Also, he's got a very fraught personal relationship with women as well. He had 3 wives. He was quite cruel to at least 2 of them. One ended up in an asylum, and then he just cut her off. The second one is a student of his when he's at university. He's in his late 60s. She's only 30. He divorces her but keeps her strung along as well, and then marries someone else. And it's a bit of a mess. And his treatment of women, I think, is a little bit questionable, which then, because, that's where his micro or personal context really makes me think, maybe there's something to this misogyny. Is it something you want to talk about in your essay, though? That will come up down to what you want to do. But for a Module C text, that idea of the misogyny might be the thing that you grapple with, some sort of either feminist or anti-feminist manifesto, or something that kind of looks at the issue in a more centered way. I don't consider myself to be an extreme feminist, but I am a feminist, and I found the poem quite at points confronting. And then I found myself going, but there's so much other good stuff here, so what if he is a misogynist? And then I've grappled with that myself, so I understand where these people are coming from, and you will probably have the same sorts of issues that you're grappling with as you read his work. And then we have image of dried up geraniums, dusting crevices, and femininity. We have the female smells in shuttered rooms. That's the line that I'm really going to kind of come back to. Is he talking about all those smells that women make with, hairspray, product, perfumes, body washes, all those little things that, if you're a woman and you share a bathroom with other people, particularly men, they go, whoa, that's overpowering, and they start sneezing and carrying on. Or is it something a bit more sinister? Is he talking about women in a derogatory, disgusting sort of a way? And you hope that he's not, but there's some proof that sort of keeps coming up about his context, himself, his own treatment of women, that really makes it hard to justify it as anything other than potentially misogynistic in nature. So half an hour later, 4 o'clock in the morning, he's gone home. His room is very tidy by the sounds of it, quite meticulous. And he's putting his shoes near the door. He's getting himself ready so that in the morning he can start this cycle all over again, the mundane nature of life, and he's going to get going with his day again, and we're going to go through the same old. So we've got this idea of memory coming up, the nocturnal observations. These are just some notes that I've added as part of the summary. Have a little read through those. We'll go over some of this as we go through the deconstruction. And we're going to start with the poem, but what I'm going to do is actually do that in a new video. I did get some feedback that the videos were a bit long, so I'm going to make this a context video, and the next video will have the deconstruction. But just in case you don't tune in for that, I'm going to just flick through the slides so that you've got the stanzas of the poem if you want them. The next video will really deconstruct what's going on in all of these, and you can see just by the fact that the way that I'm sliding through them, you can see the irregular lengths of lines and of the actual stanzas, so take note of that. And then we've got this little line that just hangs there. Anyway, I'll be back for the annotations in another video, and hopefully you're a bit more across the context now and the summary and ready to really delve into it. I'll see you for the annotations in a moment.